Hello, readers of Ye Old Magic blog. I'm back again with Tyler Erickson, and we're here to talk about something that this eats your lunch a lot of the time. It kind of pisses you off when just this whole prospect of a magician getting ready to do a trick, and the first thing it does is he stands up and gets into his pose. Or
Yeah, I like the way that things that I observe as being possible difficulties of the magician or things to overcome become having my lunch eaten and now I'm pissed off. I suppose it's a good characterization. I do see myself starting to turn green, and I don't think you'd like me when I'm angry.
right.
But yeah, I mean it's just a matter of training because if you become a professional magician or even a part-time pro, you notice the value of material that can be done without a table, standing and surrounded. But the logic that we can infer from those skills is that that's what you want. You want material that you can do without a table, standing and surrounded. But that again is kind of a limited viewpoint because the way I look at it, I want the table. I want to sit down at a table with the people when I can. Now, I also recognize I can't always do that because there's not space at the table or the table is too big and there's a centerpiece and people on the far side can't see, etc., etc. So, of course, this is not something you can do all the time. However, it is such a misstep to not learn how to perform at a table, and I'll give you some reasons why.
Are you talking about seated at a table or
Yes,
standing at a table?
seated
Or
at a table.
okay,
Because again, anybody that can work standing and surrounded can also work standing next to a table because you're probably not going to set anything down on that table. You're going to stand next to the table and perform up in the air and everything. The the power of the table, and there are several things that come with it. A lot of people think, oh, now I can do lapping. True, maybe, depending on where the people are at the table, but that's not really the big thing. The power of the table is it makes you one of the group. When you are standing by a table, as my friend Sean put it, it's like you're the waiter who doesn't know when to leave. You're there, you're looming over them, you're clearly not part of the group. Now, it is a position of dominance, so it gives you that, but there's just things that happen there that I would prefer to avoid. So for myself, I like to sit with the people when at all possible. And again, I'm going to be making those choices based off of the practicality of doing so. But when you sit at a table, you are absorbed into the group. If you're doing your job well, now you're on their same level. You are like one of their own friends. And it allows you the ability to get things out of your hands. If you've heard me say the phrase before, the poison of the hands, it's just to reiterate for those who haven't. If I am touching the cards, if I am touching the coins, then I could theoretically be manipulating them. So if I can set them down on the table so that I am not in contact with them, it suggests that everything is fair.
and this brings to mind Roberto Giobbi's great quote about the best grip that a person could have for the deck of cards is basically just setting it on the table and getting the hands away.
Right. The best grip is no grip. By taking the cards out of your hands, you now make it impossible for you to be doing sleight of hand. And as we've mentioned in other topics, this now allows the audience to focus on you if you're talking to them or doing something because they don't have to worry that whatever it is you're holding, you're secretly doing something too. So if I have the cards in my hand and I'm talking, they may glance down periodically just to make sure I'm not doing something sneaky. Whereas if I set them on the table, now they can give me their full attention. So the power of the table is the ability to create clean time, time when nothing sneaky is going on and the audience can feel that you are not doing anything. Masters of this include Roberto Giobbi and Juan Tamariz. So you really, really feel like they weren't doing anything because a good percentage of the time they weren't. And you could sense that because of their disconnection from the prop.
Right? Jay Sankey talked about something that was intriguing to me a long time ago. The idea that the magician's role a lot of the time in presentation is to send images at
Yes.
people, and I think in the context that he was talking about, it was more along the lines of the image of where a prop is or
Mm-hmm.
a state of some kind.
Yeah.
But if we can even extrapolate that further to talk about the image of the magician as a whole with relation to his props, like Juan Tamariz likes to have lots of photos of himself with the props out of his hands. He likes to sell that image a lot
Yeah.
of the
Not
time.
only with the props out of his hands, but with his hands palm out towards the audience so they can clearly be seen empty. Lots of empty handed gestures. And that is a conscious choice on his part, and his performances are loaded with it, and consequently, you get that sense of, but he didn't do anything. He didn't touch the cards. It's so easy to remember it that way because only a small amount of time was spent actually in contact with the cards, and so much more of it was spent giving directions and playing invisible violins and just making general open-handed gestures throughout. But I think just to touch on something you said earlier about the pictures, there's been a number of people who've brought up pictures. Juan Tom Rees has brought up pictures in terms of spatial relation and in terms of the empty-handed palms, but also Aaron Fisher has talked about people thinking in terms of snapshots. And I myself have actually got a theory that I talked about called snapshot theory. So I think that lots of people are coming to the conclusion that the brain tends to see things as kind of these snapshots in time, less of a flowing movie and more of just these moments. And so the more work you put in to hammer in a specific image, the more you can reap the benefits later on.
And the table can help you do this.
Absolutely. The table helps create that clean time. And I haven't heard anybody else use the word clean time. It's just something I came up with because it kind of captures the essence of what I'm talking about, where it seems like absolutely fair, because it is. You're not touching the prop.
So, do you think that magicians are not taking enough advantage of the opportunity, not just sitting, but also to use the table as clean time?
Right.
I mean, presumably you could do that while you're standing as well.
You could, absolutely. And that would be the first step, because like anything else, if you are very strong in one category, I've made this parallel before, but if you go to the gym and you pick up this heavy weight and you curl it, but only with one arm all the time, then that one arm gets big and strong and the other one stays all wilted and wimpy. So what you'll find is as you go to lift something, you will always go to your strong arm. And the arm that needs the exercise doesn't get it. Meanwhile, the one that's already big just gets bigger. So when it comes to the table, the magician sits down and feels uncomfortable, feels powerless, and therefore defaults to the standing position and works from there, instead of starting to develop the skills that would allow him or her to work at the table. Now, one of the training wheels ways you can get into it is to start setting things on the table. You don't necessarily want the magic to happen at the table level, because if you're standing at the table, now you've got that crotches backdrop kind of magic, and it's just better for sight lines if you lift things up and hold them near your face, if that's where you're going to be performing standing at the table. But you can use it as a place for putting things and getting them out of your hands. At the very least, you can start to create clean time in that respect.
One thing that you mentioned earlier that struck me was the idea that maybe magicians should feel like they aren't, because they're not a part of the group. They're like this sort of weird, arbitrary social addition to the group. They don't want to sit down because that would be presumptuous.
Okay, that's a very fair point. And whenever you start talking about magic theory and performance, you have to be very careful, because you in your mind know that of course I wouldn't say that to this person, and of course I wouldn't do that to this person, but that's a case by case scenario, and you're kind of hoping that the person listening into this or reading what you've written will understand that you have that kind of a sensitivity to what's going on socially. But the way that I tend to look at it is, if I arrive at a table and I perform something first, I don't just sit down. That's ridiculous. We know you can't just sit down with somebody who doesn't know you. But you do something and the crowd accepts you. They like you. Then they want you to sit with them.
Does that thing have to be a magic trick that you do?
Not necessarily. I mean, most often it probably will be, because it kind of establishes what you'll be doing once you sit down. But it could just be introducing yourself and being very pleasant. And at that point, they would invite you to sit down. But the point is that I could go there, I could do some magic while standing, read the crowd, and then decide whether I want to sit with them. It's not so much that they will tell you to sit down, though oftentimes I have been invited to sit before I've even made any indication or clarified it to myself that I should be doing this. The invite comes. But you can read the group and decide, should I enter into this? Maybe they don't seem all that receptive to what you're doing, but they would tolerate your presence if you sat down. I don't want to sit down with people who are just accepting me because it's the polite thing to do.
I guess it would be great if we could have a situation like Eugene Berger or Don Allen had, where it was pretty much accepted that they were going to be coming to the table and sitting down. That was sort of a given before they even show up.
Right. For anybody who's seen how that worked out, You look at that and you just lust after the idea of people requesting you to come over. Well, first of all, someone other than yourself tells people about you. Oh, we have this magician and he's wonderful. If you'd like to see him, please let me know. And then the people request you, and then the person comes and introduces you. This is Eugene Berger. And then you sit down with the people and off you go. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. But we can create some of that by being our own warm up act, by coming to the table and not immediately launching into performance if it's possible. Again, everything is a matter of sizing up the performance and deciding what you can and cannot do. I currently work at a club where the people come in sometimes 2 hours before the show starts. Not my show, but it's a comedy club. And so I know I'm going to be with them for a while. So I don't have to immediately do anything. I walk up, I introduce myself, I let them know that I'm the pre-show entertainment, and that in a little bit I'll be coming back and showing some things. And if some new people end up sitting next to them, be sure to warn them that I'm coming. And that way, the next time I'm at the table, I have a guaranteed 2 or 3 or 4 or more people who are already smiling and wondering what I'm going to do, as opposed to having to introduce myself cold.
I guess that would be something you'd have to work out with the management of the bar or establishment so that they don't see. Presumably, they hired you to be a magician, so they want to see you doing magic, and they don't want you to be the most expensive greeter on the planet.
It's true, but I think what they see is me being places with people, and what they hear is people coming out saying, "We really liked that magician." And as long as they're getting that kind of feedback, there's not been much micromanagement. In fact, there's been zero micromanagement from what I've seen. I've had a number of clients tell me that they are very happy with the way things tend to work. And I don't know how much they are aware of exactly what I've done, but I do know that the results seem to be that it's worth doing. And I have, as of yet, not run into any part where the client is unhappy. But then again, that gets into how I book events and things like that too. So that's a whole nother ball of wax. But mainly, there's the mini greetings that I will do just to get people used to who I am, and then the walking up and the doing the magic. And like for instance, in the comedy club, I don't sit with the people. I would like to. I've been invited to on many occasions, but this particular club owner likes it when I'm standing so that other people can see that I'm there. And I do understand his viewpoint. I think that becomes, if it were up to me, I would sit in the beginning when many of the seats are empty and there's only a few people here and there. And then as there's more and more people at a table, when I arrive, I stay standing for more visibility. That would be what I would want to do. But, again, you default to the person who's hired you. If that's what they want, then that's what they get.
In your experience, or maybe just in terms of the way that you perceive things, do you think a lot of magicians avoid using the table just because it's easier not to have to cross train that way?
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing. Cross training is a word I use a lot. And I think they're probably the most popular mentality for the performing magician is to want to have material that works everywhere. It works when I'm standing, it works when I'm sitting, it works when I'm surrounded, it works indoors, it works outdoors, it instantly resets, and there's a lot of benefit to that. I have a core performance uh, grouping of effects that will work just like that. However, I have things that work only at a table but work exceedingly well. And again, I'm not talking about things with lapping. I'm just talking about maybe there's packets of cards that get laid out in a row. You cannot do that in any practical sense without a table. So the idea for me is that the table is a boon and it's something to be sought out because it makes what you do stronger. So be able to utilize it. However, be able to operate without it.
That's interesting. Are we going to talk about the work that you have on what's that trick with the 7 packets and there's 3 cards to a packet?
No,
You
I'm
know,
sitting on the secret to that.
you're keeping that one, eh?
Yeah, I
That's
believe that what you're talking about, those actually 3 rows of 7 cards. Let's not get my legacy screwed up here.
right. I'm sorry about that. It strikes me that certain types of magicians, like a lot, there are different kinds of magicians out there. Some of them really gravitate towards the hardcore finger flinging stuff, and the other magicians, they don't even want to go anywhere near that. They just want the trick to sort of be like self-contained, like involve a gimmick of some kind or be a self-worker.
Right?
It almost strikes me that those magicians that go the easy route would almost have a little bit of an advantage when it comes to the table because because the trick is doesn't involve any kind of manual dexterity. They don't have to worry about the orientation of their forearms against the table if they have to do a pass or something
That
like
that
that.
there's truth to that, but there's also a little bit of an assumption there because even mechanical tricks are affected by angles and positioning, and so they might be easier to do while standing versus sitting. But by far and large, I think that's fair to say that people who work with gimmicks and are doing less sleight of hand could probably fare easier at a table with less adjustment. Because to go back to one of the discussions we had before, we talked about angle of vision and how certain sleights are designed for a specific angle of vision. And that means when you sit down at the table, since you no longer have the same sight lines, you will now have to adapt to that and take on new techniques. And really, it's not as much work as a person might think. It's just going to be, as I mentioned before, if you've got a strong arm and a weak arm, initially, you just don't like doing anything on the weak side. You just reject it, like, ugh, I don't like the way this feels. And you immediately want to stand up and make everything all better. But if you tough it out and you just start to practice at the table, one of the things I did to start bringing myself into this, because there was a time when I was just like what I'm griping against, when I could only perform standing up. When I sat at the table, I could just feel like someone had robbed me of 90% of my power. I couldn't do a top change very easily. The pass was really impractical. Palming became difficult. It's like everything just became harder. And so I just didn't want to be there. But what I started to do was every time I was sitting at a table, I would just take out my cards and shuffle them and just kind of doodle around. I wouldn't perform for anybody, but I would just have them in my hands. I was just acclimating myself to the idea of being there. And when I was teaching classes, and this is funny because people tend to think that a magic instructor or any instructor knows everything they need to know and is going to be teaching you how to do it. But the truth is that pretty much all of them are still learning themselves. The best instructors, I would think, and it's been said, the best teachers are those who are still students. And so as I was teaching my classes, I was starting to work on my own table technique. And at the point where I felt okay about it, I just started to be sitting at the table as I was holding the classes. Rather than having everybody stand and work on things, we would now be sitting there and working on things. So in a way, my students were benefiting because they were getting table training right away, and I was kind of not playing a game of catch up, but only being ahead of them by a little bit because the table was still somewhat unfamiliar to me. So I trained a lot harder once they were starting to work there because I didn't want them to see me unable to function at the table. Sometimes that's one of the greatest things about teaching is you set yourself up in a position where you say this is the way that it should be done, or this would be beneficial, or blah, blah, blah. And you know that you can't even do it yourself yet. Even though you know you're right and that it should be something you should do, you haven't actually learned it. And by putting it out there, by arming the students with this information, you're essentially putting them in a position of power where they could catch you not able to do it. So now there's a lot more psychological motivation to hurry up and develop those skills.
One thing that you taught me a while ago, uh, with regards to trying to make the transition to the table, was that certain moves that you think might not work well at a table, you can still make work just by, turning yourself like 45 degrees in one direction or the other. So
Right.
if you can motivate that body turn, or even just start doing it like the way that Leonard Green does it,
Yeah.
um, all of a sudden techniques open up to you because now you have a little bit of free space.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's possible. Slidini, when he would sit at a table, would kind of take on this slight quarter turn posture to the side. And because of that, it caused one hand to drop to the lap and one hand to stay on the table. And that facilitated a lot of his own work, but it's easily adaptable to put other things into that. So it's difficult to do a classic pass over the top of the table, but it's relatively easy to do it if you've got a body turn going and you lock. Let's say you're turned to your left and your right hand locks against the edge of the table, then you can do your pass behind that screen, and it works out quite well, classic or turnover or what have you. But not all moves can be adapted, even with the sliding knee posture and whatnot, and they need to be essentially replaced. So as you experiment, you'll find that certain things are just as easy to do sitting as they were standing, and other things are virtually impossible. It just isn't going to work. But luckily, almost every move has some sort of a corollary, some other move that will do the same thing but is meant to be viewed from a different angle, and you replace it with that.
Right. And I guess there's the other thing too, where a lot of the times what really feels awful and unnatural in our hands, even like a slight contortion of them, um, doesn't actually look all that bad.
There's a big truth to that, and you anybody that's been in for professional photography knows that they come up and they crank your head at a weird angle and they make you rest your arm on the back of a chair, and you feel ridiculous. But then you see the picture and you can't even tell. So there is such a thing as an artificial naturalness in the sense that even though it feels fake to you, it looks good to them.
Yeah, like it reads right. It doesn't
Hmm.
feel like you're overextending yourself.
Right.
But then there's lapping.
Right.
You like lapping.
Well, I do. I think anybody that has ever experimented with it sees the immediate power of lapping, because as long as the item you're working with is affected by gravity, you can pretty much make it disappear, reappear, or transform. I suppose the downside is if it makes any noise at all. Like things that are crinkly are not ideal. Things that are excessively heavy or pointy, or both, are not necessarily fun to lap. But by far and large, most of the things that you're going to be doodling with, whether they be cards or coins, whatnot, can be lapped. The thing is, I just want to separate the idea of working at the table from lapping, because that's not the argument that's being made. The idea is that the table is strong for many, many reasons, and lapping is just one of them. But it's a powerful technique, and you don't need to know all that many different things to make use of it. But I really have to say that it's a sad, sad thing that Slidini came along, created all these wonderful techniques, many of which, again, anybody of skill could adapt quite readily, and yet they don't. They haven't learned how to do the revolve vanish or the imp pass or any of these incredible things.
Yeah, it is a bit of a shame. It was almost like Slidini was able to take really old school magic and make it practical just so long as you're willing to sit. Like the
Hmm.
idea, for instance, of being able to show your hands totally empty and then immediately producing something,
Right,
or else being able to like apparently put an item in your hand and then showing both hands immediately empty,
right.
sleeves rolled up. Uh,
Well, the lap functions as a servant, and the servant is something that we know from the old school magicians as a critical device that all of them had. A secret shelf on the back of a table or a chair. In fact, pretty much anything on stage typically had such a thing built into them, and that allowed you to both deliver things onto the shelf so as to make it vanish, or just get rid of it, or to steal it from the shelf and therefore make it appear or bring it into play somehow. And so when the Stars of Magic happened and Slidini had the art of using the lap as a servant, that's exactly what it is. It's a way of having access to things, both to ditch and to retrieve, right in front of people, but without having to have any special apparatus. It just naturally exists as soon as you sit down.
right, and it's just even having that option there. I think people have gotten into this pattern of just not even considering it an option. Like if they have to have something hidden, well, they'll hide it in their hands, and they'll have these like fancy concealments within their hands, like
Right.
the what is it, the JW grip, or like the
Yeah.
edge grip, or things like
Hmm.
that. And that is supposed to, you take a coin, you put it in the other hand, and then you strike that pose, and
Hmm.
apparently the coin is gone now.
Right.
It strikes me as weak a lot of the time.
Well, you've heard me talk about it, that the difference between the old school magicians and the new ones are that the old school magicians, lacking a lot of technical finesse and sleight of hand abilities, had superior strategy. They had pockets on the back of their legs called pochettes that were easy to ditch and to steal from. They had deep pockets built into their tails coat called a profund, where things would just go like a one-way trip, similar to how a top it works, and superior to a toppet in the sense that the hand could drop all the way to the side and drop something in. With a toppet, you need kind of a rising energy action in order to launch something into there. A lot of times there are obviously some variant techniques, but for the most part, the toppet requires a little bit of energy to get the thing you're holding into the toppet, whereas this, just the act of dropping the arm, would pretty much put the item into the profund. And so they had all these strategies for stealing things and ditching things. And re- even though their sleight of hand ability may not have been as good for lack of options because we've put a lot of focus on close-up technique. And so, of course, we're going to have better looking vanishes and handlings than they probably had a couple hundred years ago. They still would be able to deliver better magic pound for pound than modern day performers because the modern day performer does not typically have access to those same tools. They do not have a ditching strategy or a stealing strategy. So as you mentioned, they just continue to hold things out in their hands. And that is not as convincing. It just can't be.
Yeah, what was that thing called? It was called like the revolve vanish or something that you had to do really, really close to your jeans pocket in order to make the coin totally vanish.
Yeah, I
And
forget what exactly the name of that trick was, but it is a lesser version of better ditches that have existed for years. Ross Bertram had a ton of really wonderful ditches into natural existing pockets, whether it be a coat breast pocket or side pockets or jean pockets, just crazy good looking stuff. And this is something that somebody invented, and it's not bad looking, but it is compromised by, you say, having to keep the hand in a kind of a strange position and close to the body. But it again suggests to you just how little our our current crop of magicians is aware of what is open to them as far as tools. And it would be the kind of thing where if you drove a car, you'd be like, hey, there's supposed to be a pedal on the floor that makes the thing stop. I'm not going to get in this until that pedal is there. Or there's supposed to be this gear that lets the car go backwards. If I can't be able to go backwards, then driving this thing is going to be not anywhere near as functional. And so something that the old school magicians would just consider like absolutely you need to have this, we've pretty much forgotten about.
yeah, I feel almost I felt a little bit torn for a second there about actually talking about that vanish by name, just because of the fact that could constitute exposure to a certain extent. But if you think about it, if the last place that they see the coin is, right near a pocket and the coin is totally gone, yeah, you'd have to be performing for like a dullard for them not to even,
Well,
come close to making that
the
connection.
theory is that they don't know exactly the moment the coin disappeared, and so after you've apparently picked it up, it's going to vanish in a point in space far away from the pocket,
Well, if it's
and
done well.
if it's done well. So I
Yeah.
mean, but we always have to assume when we talk about things that we're thinking about them in their idealized sense, because any move that isn't done well can be easily figured out.
Right.
But going back to the whole table thing, there's a handful of things that I'd recommend for any sleight of hand performer. One is knowing how to utilize the table for things like clean time, and also learning to adapt to sleights so that you can either remain sitting down when it's time to start performing, you're sitting with friends or other people, and you want to do something, you are not forced to stand if you don't want to. I also suggest learning how to do a number of sleights ambidextrously, because while certain things don't matter to be done ambidextrously, like a double turnover does not need to be done in both hands, but a false transfer does, because we transfer things in both directions, and it really shouldn't always happen in one direction. There's plenty of times when things have to go from left to right and from right to left, not just one way. So understanding how to do all those things ambidextrously is incredibly important. And if you just bite the bullet and learn these things in the beginning and aren't forced into a situation where the trick shows up and then you have to learn it, you'll be ahead of the curve and able to utilize those tools. And it really opens you up to possibilities. You see things differently once you have the abilities. It's just the absolute truth that we have a way of kind of blinding ourselves to our options by falsely limiting ourselves in a sense of a dominant hand kind of thing, or I have to be able to do this standing, or whatever it is. It's perfectly okay to have routines that only work when you're sitting down, as long as they're worth it. Pick strong things. There are things I do that are incredibly strong, and I can't do them when I'm standing, but I love being able to sit down and deliver them because they are better than what I typically can do without the table. Let's face it, out of this world is a table effect. You're not going to be able to do that strolling about, and yet it's considered to be the greatest card trick that's ever been. So there is merit to working at the table. And then there's the social aspect to it. So there's just a lot of reasons to learn this, and very few reasons not to, aside from I just don't want to take on the extra work.
And I guess one other thing about this quest for material that will work, whether you're standing up, sitting down, or you're standing, they're sitting, or whatever. Um, what ends up happening is that certain tricks become perhaps like overdone for the public, like things
Right.
like Crazy Man's handcuffs, for instance.
Crazy Man's handcuffs, $100 bill switch, ambitious card are things that everybody does because they work under all circumstances. And so if you want to start developing variety and stand out, then you want to start looking at both cosmetic changes, as I mentioned before, working with items that are not as commonly used instead of coins, using bottle caps and whatnot, but also in your ability to utilize the environment for what it provides you. If you can sit down at a table, do it. I guess the last way that I've looked at it is if you're like a martial artist and you've learned how to defend yourself with your bare hands, and you're in a room and you're being attacked and there's a gun or there's a knife or there's a club sitting right there, but you still choose to fight with your bare hands, that's stupid. I mean, it's right there and it's a powerful tool. Why not use it? And that's kind of the way the table is. Learn how to use it and then seek it out when you can. Obviously, it's not always going to be available to you, and that's where your hand to hand fighting combat skills come into play. You can still function. But ideally, you would want to have the club, knife, or gun because it's going to be the better way to go.
Especially if the method offers features. We've talked about this before.
Right.
Different methods offer different features.
Mm-hmm.
And Magic is essentially a game of not playing fair with your audience.
That's right.
And so if you can see a feature in something that's there, then why not take advantage of it?
You know it.